You don't want me to work after I put in my 2 weeks, okay? So when I was in my early 20s, I worked at a well-known sandwich franchise. I actually really liked my job and I would open and close. I'd also come in whenever anyone called out because I lived 5 minutes away. One day my boss hires a new person, no big deal. Except my boss kept cutting my hours more and more and giving them to the new person. I went from working 30 plus hours a week to working less than 15. Oh, and I was training them. So after a few months of my hours getting cut but me still coming in whenever called, I put in my 2 weeks. My boss proceeded to not schedule me a single hour after that. QMC, one of my coworkers who would call in regularly, didn't come in to open the store at 6 a.m. I drove by at 11 and it was still dark. My old boss had called me to ask if I could open for her. Nope, you didn't want to give me any hours after I put in my 2 weeks, figure it out. Well, I drove by that store for a couple weeks and wouldn't you know, it was only open half the time. If an employer can fire you with no notice, you can quit with no notice. Training a potential replacement and have your hours cut? That is not cool. Some companies would rather you do not work after having received your notice to quit. +1 for standing up to them. We had a fast food place in my town back in the early 2000s that rarely actually fired anyone. They would just cut their hours down until they quit, like to less than 10 if they were persistent. It was usually because the person had been around long enough that they were supposed to get a raise. They'd get them to quit and just hire new min-wage people. Surprise, surprise. They got shut down several times for food safety issues and then went out of business. I once had a boss try to cut my hours because they hired someone they wanted to date and used the excuse that I wasn't reliable. So I brought in all of my end-of-shift receipts. I was a delivery driver and I got a receipt of how many deliveries I did that night as well as my hours. Since I started, and I got my hours back because they knew I'd bring it to their boss if it didn't change. Needless to say, the new hire only stayed a few months before quitting anyway. It was a weird situation all around. Was the bosses paying new people less than you? Good on you. Some old BS, they giving your hours away and expecting you to bail them out all the time, lol. Sounds like you jumped off a sinking ship, sadly not too uncommon with poor management. Been there. Worked at the overnight pet hotel at a well-known pet establishment. My supervisor decided she wanted to step down from her role to work hourly instead of salary, to spend more time at home with her kids. She said, I started slowly losing my hours to her until I was working maybe 11 a week. Different places have different policies. Check with HR when you're hired about what to do when you quit. I worked mostly at big companies with the same policy. Give 2 weeks notice to be able to collect unemployment or maybe get a reference. They could then decide whether they needed you for those 2 weeks or not. In IT, especially the last 20 years, they don't want you to stay because a quitting employee can do a lot of damage to critical systems. Not that I ever did. It's a courtesy in the professional world, not a requirement. Hi boss, you owe me back pay of 387 hours. In cash, thanks. It's pretty common these days to be asked to leave immediately after placing a 2-week notice. I'm not sure why the boss would have the nerve to call you to fill in only during your last 2 weeks. I'm glad you didn't go in though. 2 weeks notice is a courtesy to an employer you'd like to use as a reference or maintain pleasantries with. Quit and move on if you like. 2 weeks notice is not an employment termination requirement in any state. I work in an industry where there are distinct barriers to entry for the pool of qualified workers. I hire people who are going to work for my employer, and I also accept or reject potential subcontractor employees. I see the same people move between employers and contacts over the years. If someone bailed on me without the courtesy of 2 weeks' notice, it's highly unlikely that I or any other person in an equivalent role in my company will hire them again on another contract. We had the owner of a small subcontractor working on one of our contracts, and he jumped to a competitor's contract with 0 notice. No candidate he has offered since has been accepted on any contract at my company, and he has not been invited to partner on any other contracts since. There certainly are many contexts where leaving on good terms doesn't make a difference, but there are some where it really does. Go you, but it is tedious compliance at best. Any idea why they were cutting your hours? P.S. and yay you for not bailing out that A0 Egyptian pounds boss of yours after they totally disregarded your commitment and loyalty. Wow, that's sweet vindication. What do you do for work now? Never, ever give a 2 weeks notice. Pro tip: you can file for unemployment insurance for the reduction in hours.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epic Haircast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.